when clinical trial protocols were initially created, there, and I'm paraphrasing immensely here, but there was basically a discussion of, if we're going to test the safety of something in humans, which is stage 2 of a clinical trial, we need to test in what is considered a stable subject. And a stable physical subject is something that is relatively standard, relatively healthy, and relatively non-changing. And from the medical community of the past, that meant that the hormonal changes of women over the course of a month was unstable. We've learned in the many decades since then that males also have a hormonal cycle, right? It's not like we just have the exact same hormones all the time. It's just much flatter and much longer, but, we still have a hormonal cycle. But women have one that's much more palpable, and that was considered unstable as a test subject. And so the prevailing methodology that came out of that was that regardless of what the drug or the clinical test is for, regardless of who that thing is for and who it will be used with in the market, a clinical trial for safety purposes at stage 2 is tested exclusively on healthy males between 25 and 35.
Labs podcast by SundayPyjamas.
Welcome to the Research Labs podcast. I have been talking a lot about what you are doing, especially with a lot of my female friends and also family, including my mom. In India, I don't think a lot of people remember it now, but malaria was like a very big problem. And my mom works in that department. Like her job is to make sure that the new children are given the vaccines on time. So even during the COVID times, right, she was one of the frontline team members, and she was not even allowed to like stay with us. So she was given like quarters, and she was doing all those jobs during the pandemic. And uh, like she's my mom. She's quite old now, but there are a lot of females in her staff which are very young, just getting started with their careers. And so I talked about the UTI free initiative that you are working on, and also the PCOS discussion we briefly had. And even she kind of mentioned that when she was, let's say, getting started with in her working days, right, in the early days, UTIs and PCOS were not widely discussed.
Yeah.
And she kind of told me that maybe they had it and they didn't even know they had it. But like the younger generation is definitely having a lot of conversations about it, which is a good trend. But even I think you also mentioned that there are a lot of myths as to how to cure it. And I would say she readily agreed to that idea that people are not really sure like what to do and how do you actually got it. So to begin with, right, could you share how you got introduced to this problem in particular, and what kind of made you feel compelled that this is something I would like to spend my time on.
Yeah, so there's sort of two ways that we find people get involved in this topic, and one way is you either are a sufferer or you are a close family member of a sufferer. Particularly of recurrent UTIs, um, but also of other misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed pelvic health issues, and that includes PCOS, which you mentioned, but also the other kind of female plague of our time is endometriosis, which is also very misunderstood, has a lot of common myths and misinformation, and is also very hard to diagnose because no one is taught how to diagnose it. And that's true of all of these conditions, right? The tests and identification structure that exists for these things, is, if it exists at all, is very, very old. The standard culture, the standard urine culture test is a test that was developed in the 1950s for a completely different purpose and is now used ubiquitously in the world as the gold standard, but actually at the best of times is only 50% accurate, and at the worst of times much worse than that, and it is biased to only one pathogen, so it really only picks up, a very small percentage of what's actually going on. So I got into this through that sort of first mechanism, which is a family member of mine suffered. In fact, my partner suffered very severely from recurrent UTIs for 4 years. And it was an issue that, we spent a lot of time on and a lot of grief and strife on, a lot of mistreatment by the medical profession, you know, believing that regardless of what the patient says, if the dipstick comes back showing no infection, then it can't possibly be an infection. So it's all in your head. This is, it does take a certain personality to kind of keep fighting through that over and over again. But we find more and more that women who recover, who have had recurrent UTIs and have recovered, it, they've all gone through the same story. They've all had this fight. They've all been ignored. They've all felt left down by the medical community. And we felt like that. And we assumed, after doing a lot of research into it for our own purposes, we could see patterns, in the market that implied that we were not the only people having this problem, and that the information that was most recent, the studies and the research and the outcomes and the diagnostics that were most recently done and developed around these topics were impossible to find unless you knew how to do scientific research, unless you knew how to go read papers, unless you knew how to dig past, academic paywalls to get access to journals and stuff like this. Without that, it was impossible as a consumer to find information that was more recent and more relevant and more helpful about how to deal with these issues. But also, it was very difficult to find resources that made it clear that you weren't alone. And this is, I think, one of the most significant parts of how we built Live UTI Free the way we have, is we don't have a community in the sense that there isn't a forum or a conversation space, because there's a lot of issues with that in the medical community, and we can talk about that separately. But we've tried to make it very, very clear in all of our content that if you have pelvic pain and your doctor is not listening to you, you are not alone. You are not the only person with this problem. And whether it's a UTI or something else, there are methods to achieve diagnosis. There are professionals who do want to help you. They may be few and far between, the ones that really know what to look for, but they are there. And, as a result of that, we also encourage people to get in touch with us, and we try and provide them with those resources. And so that's how we got into it, was this sort of series of realizations that, we were very privileged. We knew how to dig past those walls, particularly my partner who runs the UTI Free. We knew how to dig past those walls. We were more informed than your average consumer. We were looking at it from a market perspective, from a science perspective, from a research perspective. We were seeing all these things, which allowed us access to then work towards our own solution. And then we realized that, what we used as our solution wasn't available to anyone else. So we kind of started creating Live UTI Free as an effort to share that with more women in the world.
What piques my interest here is, why would the medical community who is incentivized to help people is not doing it already? Why are they using a test which is designed in the 1950s?
It's a very good question. It's not the easiest to answer, because in a way I have to state some sweeping generalizations here, right? So obviously there's always exceptions. So to anyone who listens to this and goes, well, my doctor doesn't do, or I don't do, or whatever, that's fine. If you don't do this, great. But what we've seen, this is majoritively true, which is doctors are confined to the education they were given and the medical guidelines of their jurisdiction. And by jurisdiction, I mean your country or your state or whatever governmental regulatory body controls clinical standards in your area, is what you follow. And basically, let's talk about the education piece first. So if you're going through the education, medical education is mostly by rote, right? Which means that you learn something and you repeat that exact thing, right? It's a series of protocols and procedures. It's basically, medical textbooks are basically, giant lists of standard operating procedures. And your job is to know as many of them as possible and to, get good at enough of them to apply to whatever form of medical practice you wish to pursue. And very rarely in medical education is there conditions or allowance for interpretation. Everything is built on kind of a decision tree model. And having not done a medical degree myself, right, I'm speaking through the experience of the medical practitioners who have shared this with us. So I'm a conduit of information. Obviously, I don't have my own experience with this. But this is kind of what we've been told from many jurisdictions in the world, India, all the way to different parts of Africa, Europe, North America, South America. The consensus on this is pretty standard. So that's the education component. And then there's the clinical standards component, which the education is usually built on. And clinical standards exist as a rule book for what is correct and incorrect medical practice. This is the regulatory and legal standard that allows malpractice suits to be defined. And so there is very little incentive for a practitioner to intentionally step outside of guidelines, because it's against what they were taught and it's against the clinical standards that surround them and regulate their work. And potentially, if not well considered or contracted, leaves them open to making mistakes by default of the medical standards or clinical standards, which then can cause issues. Now, yes, there are ways around that, and there are ways to operate alongside or, outside of guidelines that is still obviously medically and legal compliant. But the point I'm trying to make is that the entire incentive and education structure biases you away from exploring anything that's not standardized. The average time to market from new research to use in clinical practice is 17 years.
Wow.
So, and that's in like the fastest moving ecosystems. So if you're talking about ecosystems where we don't even have enough data to say what the adoption rate is, it's probably even slower.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to see change in medical practice unless it is considered severely life-threatening at scale. So you see, but I say that you see things come to light faster for like cancer research and stuff because it's very ubiquitous, it's everywhere, it's very deadly, there's many variations. But even within that, new practice and new diagnostics for cancer takes a decade to get to market. It's the lower end of the 17 average, but it still takes a very long time. So if you're talking about something that is not life-threatening, and by the way, is predominantly experienced by women, which is a whole other thing about the education that we can talk about, then it's very unlikely to see accepted progress. And examples of that are, our team right now routinely goes through a process of submission to journals because we produce research papers all the time. It's quite common if you're presenting new data, like completely new original data sets, and those can be validated as good methodology, it's quite common to have to apply to a few journals, over the course of 3 to 6 months to get something to accept. In our case, it takes on average at least a year and 6+ applications. It's like very, very, very difficult to get anyone interested in new data, particularly patient perspective data, but new data that could help clinicians treat women who are suffering from chronic pain. And that's just an overwhelming issue. And sort of the last thing I'll flag is just, again, the sort of medical bias issue. So if you look at education textbooks in almost every single country, they are built around the concept of he. Every single basis of medical terminology and practice is based around the male. So we often say female health is a bit of a myth because actually we don't really know what female health should look like. It hasn't been studied enough. It hasn't been used in clinical trials enough. We don't know, in base clinical practice for most of the world, a heart attack is a heart attack. But it's been proven multiple times over in multiple jurisdictions and medical communities that a female heart attack, the symptoms, the experience, the patterns are entirely different than what we know as heart attack. But that's not taught in schools and it's not taught in ERs. And as a result, females suffer heart attacks that go unidentified because the symptom pattern is not associated with heart attacks in the medical community. Things like this. So if heart attacks, the most kind of basic middle-aged day-to-day stuff, is not being properly identified in women, how can we expect, anything that's chronic pelvic pain, which is a piece of anatomy that is hugely understudied, to be diagnosed properly? And we can't, which is why we're in this predicament.
You mentioned that you have to apply 6 times. So does it mean you have to reapply the same thing 6 times to get in?
You have to adjust for every journal usually. So when you apply to research journals or to medical journals, you have to, they all have very specific specifications of how many words long it has to be, what content bias it needs to have, what pieces of data does it need to display within the paper versus reference, things like this. So every time you apply, you have to refactor the paper for that specific journal, which is a lot of work. So it's, we spend an enormous amount of time refactoring the same paper for the next journal application. And we would consider it, as far as independent bodies that operate in the medical community go, we're very young and we've moved very fast, right? We've been around since 2017, so 5-6 years. And, as a private, non-charitable organization in the medical patient space and research space, we've come a very, very long way very quickly. So there's a certain amount of patience that we have for just having to kind of prove each step. But when we see our, male counterparts or papers that are published that are completely the wrong data set on the same topic over and over and over again, it's very, very frustrating, right? We have genuine patient perspective data that proves a point and scientifically follows a very strict methodology. And here we are, a paper with a sample of 40 women that was just tested the same way they've always been tested and is just confirming bias. Oh, that gets published, over and over and over again by different researchers who just need their name on a paper. And it's just, that's very frustrating to witness from our perspective.
What I'm thinking is so from what you are saying, right? It's like the medical research is excluding 50% of the human population. And that's a really big problem. Do you think it's because of how the incentives are designed in the system, that kind of, like as you mentioned, right, people simply want their name on the paper?
Yeah.
So do you think it's an incentive problem that these things are just ignored like that for so long, or is there a different problem?
I mean, well, there's 2 components. And again, I think, you could have a whole nother version of this discussion with my female counterparts at Live UTI Free who would obviously lend their, being female as well, lend their own perspective on this. I think from the male side of the table, 2 things are very, very, very obvious. One is that, we've established in the last 5-10 minutes that the medical community moves very slowly. The medical system was designed in most countries, the way medical practice, clinical testing, and clinical adoption works. Those systems were developed majoritively, if not entirely, by men before women had much in the way of communal rights.
Makes sense.
So it's a patriarchal system by nature that moves and changes extremely slowly compared to a lot of systems, and certainly more slowly than common societal systems. So if you just put that lens on it, you can kind of see the downward spiral, right? Which is that everything biases to a certain behavior, which means to advance as a medical practitioner, regardless of your own gender, to advance as a practitioner, you have to follow those implied or unimplied rules, which continues to enforce that bias. So, and that's how structural institutional bias works, whether it's race, creed, gender, whatever. That's generally how it works. It's just in the medical community, it's still very palpable because it changes so slowly. But if you wanted to look at a much more practical example of that, you just have to look at how clinical trials are run. So when clinical trial protocols were initially created, they're, and I'm paraphrasing immensely here, but there was basically a discussion of, if we're going to test the safety of something in humans, which is stage 2 of a clinical trial, we need to test in what is considered a stable subject. And a stable physical subject is something that is relatively standard, relatively healthy, and relatively non-changing. And from the medical community of the past, that meant that the hormonal changes of women over the course of a month was unstable. We've learned in the many decades since then that males also have a hormonal cycle, right? It's not like we just have the exact same hormones all the time. It's just much flatter and much longer, but, we still have a hormonal cycle. But women have one that's much more palpable, and that was considered unstable as a test subject. And so the prevailing methodology that came out of that was that regardless of what the drug or the clinical test is for, regardless of who that thing is for and who it will be used with in the market, a clinical trial for safety purposes at stage 2 is tested exclusively on healthy males between 25 and 35.
Wow.
Which means
Hmm.
up until now, still, the vast majority of drugs, of medical devices, of anything that is used in clinical practice that went through trials was tested almost exclusively on men before going to market. And so you could say, well, stage 3 is a market test, but okay, yes. But if stage 2, you've managed to prove by methodological standard that it's safe in humans, you're going to cook whatever you need to cook in the go-to-market stage 3 because you've already spent however many tens of millions of dollars on the previous 2 stages, and you're going to make damn sure this thing clears to market. So there's there's a deeply embedded incentive and a standard regulatory methodology for every company running a clinical trial, no matter how big or small, to prove safety on men, even if it's exclusively for female use drug, and then make sure that no matter what happens in stage 3, it looks like it's ready to go to market.
Wow.
And so you could say, well, pharmas have people's best interest in mind. And, if it really shows in market that it's going to be bad for people, they'll do something about it. Well, we've seen over and over again through how many hundreds of scandals that is clearly not true. So if they're willing to do it at mass global scale for things, why would the incentives for doing it for any female drug be different? And there's many examples of this. One of the most recent horrific ones is the vaginal mesh scandal, which is to prevent prolapse, which is a medical device that gets installed in women and then permanently destroys their pelvis. Um, there's there's just a million examples of this happening, but the simple outcome is that nothing is tested in women. We don't know. We don't know what the outcomes of clinical use of most drugs and most base over-the-counter medication. We don't clinically know what it looks like in women. What happens biologically, physically, mentally? We don't know how it impacts them. There's not enough data to say one way or the other. We know how everything affects males.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
know how everything affects you and I. You and I are privileged with the most advanced medical science in the world, but our female counterparts,
I don't know. Hmm.
it's a potluck.
So these are the problems that you guys identified, right? And from what I would say understand as of right now, is that the medical industry as a whole is very heavily regulated, a lot of compliance to go through, which makes any kind of innovation kind of, I don't know, scary. So, and it requires huge amounts of investments and a lot of brain power to just get it right. So when you look at all this, I would say obstacles to get into it. How like how did you guys, number one, figure it out, and then also kind of made it through all the obstacles? Because if you ask me, it just sounds incredibly difficult.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we've figured it out. We're still working on it, I would argue. Um, one thing that makes it easier for us is that while we assist clinical trials for drugs and devices that meet our mission and are proactive and the methodology is correct by our standards, etc. Um, the research that we directly operate or participate in is uh, is either patient perspective, so it's basically psychology. So we're not dealing with a clinical trial standard because we're not testing a device or a diagnostic or a medication, or we are testing the relationship between psychology and an existing device, diagnostic, or standard. So, we're going to be soon announcing the beginning of a very, very large study that is going to be longitudinally mapping the urinary microbiome in females. And for this, we're using a diagnostic standard and methodology that already exists. And we're layering on the psychology layers, which is then our participation and controlling the study, the collection of samples, all of that, so that with the diagnostic partner, we can then basically see what the relationship between symptomatic experiences and variance in pathogen or scales of health within the urinary microbiome. And so to kind of go back to your original question, the way we've done it is by avoiding trying to bring things to market, but instead using what's already available to do the research that has to be done because it's very basic. It's just never been done in women. Or it's never been done because it's not something that men suffer from enough to justify it being studied at scale. And so when we run a vaginal microbiome study with 1,000 participants, which is going to be one of the largest studies of its kind, much less the largest study on this particular subject because there isn't any data on it, it's going to be very, very significant. And we don't have to go, we still have to go through an IRB, like an ethics approval process. We still have to do all the academic processes, but we don't have to invest millions in clinical standard and compliance because we're not bringing anything to market, and we're not using or testing new devices or medication.
So when you say 1,000 participants, uh, does it involve like sample collection from 1,000 participants
Yeah.
and then sending the samples to the lab and then people testing this. Okay.
Yeah. So then they'll use a variation of different, much more sensitive testing methods than the standard culture. They'll be using a combination of, I have to double check which protocols they're going to use in the end, but generally what we use um, is either deep shotgun metagenomics or variations on PCR. And PCR is now kind of a little bit more known because of the whole COVID thing. Previous to COVID, PCR was really only used in laboratory studies. It wasn't so common in medical diagnostics, though it, even pre-COVID, PCR was one of the few things that you could maybe, as a consumer, find or convince your doctor to use if you clearly were experiencing urinary symptoms, but the culture was showing negative. Um, uh, and there's now companies that sort of have made that available to the UTI communities, both on a consumer and a practitioner level, but that's still very nascent. It still has a long way to go before it's really good market coverage, but certainly good market education. I mean, that doesn't exist at all really yet.
So I would say the one thing that I'm trying to understand here is I do understand that no such study is done on this particular micro, right? That exists in the urine. But I think that is an hypothesis that you and your team came up with. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I mean, okay, so the partners that we work with are the partners that have pioneered whatever science has managed to identify that urine is not sterile. Most of the world, including most medical textbooks, to go back to that, still say urine is sterile. It is not. Let's just be very clear. Your urine is not sterile. Your urine has pathogens, whether they're inflammatory or not. It has pathogens. It has other elements in it at all times, even when you're perfectly healthy. But to the point that we were making, the science that proved that only really was done 10 years ago and is still not adopted into the medical education and regulatory bodies. But it's these partners that we work with that we say, okay, we know urine is not sterile. We know, anecdotally from many, many patients testing and showing us their report, or sharing their reports, or the practitioners that we work with and, confidential data exchange with them. We know that if you do advanced testing on people experiencing symptoms, you find other pathogens than what you can find with a culture, which means we do not know what the base biome combination is for both healthy and unhealthy patients in the urinary tract. We do not know. There is no data for that, at least not in a clinical sense or a research sense. So this research is that first step. Like, you could make lots of arguments that it's not enough, and no, it's definitely not enough. But until this research exists, it's impossible to do the research that then can prove diagnostic capability or prove preventative capabilities or prove medical, or antibiotic resistance strains, like all of that is sort of known anecdotally and studied by diagnostics companies. But in terms of what the target biome composition should be for a healthy person, we don't know. So sample collection and diagnostics on both healthy and unhealthy patients is an absolutely critical piece of having this sort of initial map. And that study will then need to be repeated and proven out by other players in the world, right? Like, hopefully by establishing this baseline, you establish a methodology that then other people will repeat and confirm or deny or find new variants too, right? You do research in the hope that other people will go and do similar research. So, we're going to kind of pioneer this layer one in the hopes that other people build on layer one, and then we can try and, whether it's us or someone else, we can try and hit layer two and then eventually reach actual diagnostic capability and adoption in the medical market.
So I would say I started talking about it being a hypothesis to kind of ask you, let's say, this particular research idea or anything else that you guys are doing. How how does the initial process look like to decide, okay, this is the problem we want to go all in? Because I'm sure if you are so deep into so many different kinds of research, you must be encountering so many different problems all the time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So how does that process look like? Okay, this is okay. Micro problem is the one that we want to invest our resources in and dive in. Like, so how does that look like?
Well, it's quite different if it's us doing that in, like, if you zoom out and away from the VTI free and look at our whole portfolio and how we operate as a holding company. It's obviously the way we approach that is different on a business level than it is within the VTI free and how we approach it at a medical research or a psychological research level, patient research level. A lot of the patient research is very, very inductive. So the hypothesis is not, unless it's for something very specific, which has come out of the initial things, the hypothesis is quite broad. It's usually that if we ask people these questions, we will see a pattern that explains whether or not something is true, right? Like, this is very, very high level. And we're doing a lot of active collection of data all the time from participants, mostly about their experience, right? So in patient advocacy, you're really trying to understand and build resource and justify an individual patient's experience with an illness. And that's very important for medical advocacy. And so, that broad hypothesis leads us to, well, we need patients to answer these types of questions to give us an idea of where the boat steers. Is their experience of this particular part of the journey positive or negative, and then this part, and then this part, and then this part. And so you could say our hypothesis is that these are the parts of the journey that are significant. And is that true or not? But the outcome is very inductive. So we are then looking at all of that data. We're looking at like 6,000 data lines at a time of maybe 60 answers from each patient, and analyzing inductively what are the patterns that come out of this. What are the patient observations or the patient biases within their experience as a whole, as a collective, that sort of dictate commonality in patient experience for this particular illness or that particular illness or this particular medical environment. So it's very broad, and then the outcomes of that are then what lead to much more finite hypotheses, which are, okay, the patient's experience implies that this is really an issue. Is there existing research about this issue?
Hmm.
Yes or no? If yes, is that research any good? Or is it completely biased and done with like samples of 10 people? Which most of the time that's the case because, again, female health. And then the question internally is, of all of these things that we know we need to work towards providing answers to, which are priority and which are possible. And for our organization at our scale, at our funding rate, like, most of it is impossible. So it comes down to
What is possible?
what is possible, what can we realistically do or partner with our existing network for to move the needle, to make sure things are progressing, um, and answer a hypothesis that has come out of that initial inductive research.
So there is like a lot of work that goes before the hypothesis decided, basically.
Yeah, on the research, on the patient medical research side, yeah. You need to collect a lot of data to make sure that your hypothesis of the solutions or information or experience is really driven by the patient community. that potential of need or that potential of issue needs to come from the patient community. And then you take those and you say, okay, how do we frame this? How do we work towards an answer?
And what kind of a timeline we're talking about before it's decided? Like
Years.
this whole process.
I mean, between the collection of data, which is constant, right? We have a constant revolving door of data. We cycle the base data collection every 18 months to 2 years to a new updated version. We usually have between 5 and 15,000 data samples in that time frame, maybe more in some cases. Depending on what data type you're looking at, we have maybe 60 to 100,000 samples, but it depends on how much detail you're looking for. So we cycle those, but that means it takes at least 6 months of collection before we have enough data to start seeing a new pattern. And then that needs to be analyzed, and then a report needs to be written about that, and hopefully then published. But regardless, once it's written, then we're looking at it, and
After applying 6 times.
yeah, after applying at least 5, 6 plus times, and maybe never getting accepted anyway, and then regardless, once it's written and we kind of know what we're looking at, we're trying to figure out what's next. And I make it sound like it's very linear. Of course, it's not linear. Like anyone who says that sort of these types of research processes are linear is full of it. It's never that simple. That's the ideal escalation of process is that. How it happens depends a lot on the organic nature of what partners are active when and who's asking what questions, and which funder said, hey, I need to find an answer to this. Oh, well, we have a hypothesis for that. Like it there's a lot of things here that are much scrappier than I make them sound, for sure. But the research methodology, when it comes down to it, is very, very strict. We try and adhere to the highest standard possible because obviously, if someone wants to get really nitpicky and start ripping us apart, we want to be able to defend that at every single level. And so we work very hard to be able to defend every point of data that we use, present, or structure a hypothesis from.
Yeah. So you also mentioned the holding company. I think it's called Growth Mechanics, if I'm not wrong. Yes. So a part of the portfolio is focused on female health. Could you also like share a little bit about the other parts of the portfolio, as in what other things you guys are working on?
Sure, yeah. So the holding company we're basically like a very small company builder or studio, I guess, but studio kind of implies that you have a fund, and we don't have a fund. We're all cash based. So everything within the holding company is bootstrapped, if you want to call it that. It's all self-funded by us. All the cash flow of all the teams help the other teams stay alive. Like it's all one, big messy cobweb. And we kind of have a few different bubbles. One is the female health sort of vertical or bubble, of which we have Live UTI Free. We also have a company that we exited last year that's based in the States called Femologist, which was, or is, I should say, female health e-commerce and products built specifically for women with chronic illnesses. So very related vertical. And we're moving now. I'm not going to talk about it too much because it's all just launching in the coming 2 months, but we're working on something that's going live in sexual health. That's also, of course, related to the central vertical. It's a bit broader and will become narrower as it grows, but it's broad to sort of make sure that it can play well in the market and make enough revenue to make an impact. And then there's a couple other things in the cooker within the female health vertical. But as I've mentioned, some parts of working in the medical space are very slow. And I would say that even though those conversations and the base structure of that was set up 6 months ago, we won't see those things go public for another 2 years. So hopefully shorter, but possibly not. So, there's a lot of long long plays, irons in the fire for the female health vertical for us. And Live UTI Free will also mature and change more and more. We're doing a lot of clinical trial recruitment now, not just for data or studies that we're running, but for other studies that meet our mission. And there's some other activities that are going to be happening within Live UTI Free that are going to just kind of expand our ability to partner, but also then continue to make resource more and more available to patients. So that's sort of the female health vertical, and then we have a tech vertical or tech bubble. We have a little SaaS product that we built for ourselves and then made public, which is a research tool. It's just a qualitative research tool. It's just for very quick, scrappy discovery, research, and annotation. That will continue to mature slowly. We do have users all over the world. It's not a big tool. It's not a big usership, but it is, does have paying teams on it using it everywhere from the most recent team is in Sri Lanka. We have a team in Indonesia. We have some teams in East Africa. Obviously, some European teams, a few UK teams. It's just nice to see it being used, and we use it all the time for a lot of what we do. And then also in the tech vertical, we have a set of integrated partnerships with tech providers. Those partnerships are sometimes just like service partnerships, but in more cases than one, they're also sort of co-management partnerships. So we work, our most recent and biggest partner in terms of funding is Mint Blue, which is a development suite and API. I'm hesitant to say what it's for because it's for blockchain, and blockchain is very misunderstood. So it has nothing to do with crypto. It has nothing to do with speculation or Ponzi schemes. It has nothing to do with NFTs. It's based on the original Bitcoin protocol, which is the original blockchain protocol that was then forked into all of that crypto madness later. And it actually delivers on the promises that people like to say blockchain can bring, but unfortunately are not actually possible with BTC, Ethereum, stuff like this, or private chains for that matter, for cost reasons. So that's a fairly young company, but it's very well funded and will be making a very large impact because it's working with very, very, very large enterprise partners for adoption. So over the next 3 years, the 1,000 transactions that cost hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of euros to process in what we think of as Bitcoin or Ethereum, you'll see happen in seconds for fractions of a cent through the Mint Blue platform. And that's going to be a very significant change to how the world starts to look at blockchain technology. So that's kind of our biggest, most recent tech partnership. We have a co-management agreement with them where we're basically helping them build out the company. And then hopefully in the future, we'll have some exciting announcements about some of what Growth Mechanics and Mint Blue will be launching as joint ventures. I won't talk too much about that now, but I will suggest that it impacts our third vertical. Our third vertical is kind of encompassing sort of everything else touches it, but it's a bit broader, which is just our impact vertical. So Growth Mechanics is a holding company. We consider ourselves social impact by nature, but we don't really like to talk about ethics or impact. We have a internal belief as a team that if you build a business, it should be for the right reasons and it should be improving something in a significant way. And by improving something, I don't just mean the size of people's wallets, but beneficial access or a supply of service or goods in a meaningful way. So obviously, the female health stuff is very tied to that. Clearly, our research tool is a catalyst for that, right? That's just an enabler for us to be able to do that better and for other people to do that better. Mint Blue, it's whether it's Mint Blue or some other company, someone is going to succeed in translating the original Bitcoin protocol to being a base for data exchange in TCP/IP in the modern internet, and that will enable data control and ownership of personal data and company data exchange at a level that is unprecedented. So someone will do it. Hopefully, it's Mint Blue. It will significantly change things for the better. So we're very much on board with that. We're not on board with the whole crypto anarchist psycho crap. We don't touch any of that, but we're very on board with this because it kind of proves the inaccuracy and silliness of the whole crypto world. So we consider that tied to it, and then some of the initiatives that are being researched to be built now are very much tied to that. We're working on some legal solutions. We're working on some potential financial solutions. Things that will hopefully start to roll over the next. We're working on some diagnostic solutions. All things that will hopefully start to roll over the coming 2 years. Some of them are, as I mentioned before, in partnership with partners like Mint Blue or otherwise. Some of them are just purely internal. And not all of them will survive the sort of validation process, right? Like obviously, we cook several fires at once, hoping that one really resonates and we really see a clear business path, and then we chase that down once it's clear.
So I also wanted to ask you about the accelerator program you designed, which was adopted by Google.
Yeah, the accelerator programs were actually how Growth Mechanics started. So before being a holding company, before starting our own initiatives, Growth Mechanics was created to house an accelerator program model that we developed. And we developed that model from fairly amateurish, but nonetheless qualitative study of entrepreneurs in different markets all over the world. And when we looked at the outcomes of some of that research, we were like, well, people are kind of screaming for a construct that enables, X, Y, and Z. Surely programs that exist in the entrepreneurial space know this, right? Surely this must be a well-established principle in entrepreneurship. If we were able to kind of find it ad hoc research over 9 months, surely this is well established. And so we started, mentoring and spending times at other accelerators and realized that not only do other accelerators not know that, but they don't care at all because that's not how microfinance from a VC perspective works. So the priorities were all different. So we started developing our own sort of models for this. We tried to make it feel like existing programs sort of felt, so that it was easy to communicate. But we had very strict structure and qualifiers for how everything within a program worked. And at the same time as we were developing this, a completely separate team in Israel who was working with Google at the time came to all of the same conclusions, but had none of the structure and process that we did. And so Google wanted to do something with the programs that were happening in Israel, but couldn't figure out how to package them.
Piece it together, yeah.
And basically, after several conversations and a couple pilot runs of programs, basically brought on Growth Mechanics to build out the infrastructure for operating what then became Google Launchpad. And so we, huge credit to Jakob and the Israeli team for what they managed to achieve and accomplish with their insights and driving that into Google as an ideology. And then, we came in to basically give that shape. And to lend our research to bias against what they maybe hadn't found, because there are definitely things that were different. And then we proceeded to help build Launchpad and help them expand that program and the way it operated to 36, 34, 35, 34 to 36 countries. I can't remember what the exact number was now. And the original IP of how the program was structured was ours. So we continued to resell that into other mechanisms. And so we built the InsurTech ecosystem in Munich with partners in Munich. namely Verkeins, and then a consortium of different insurance partners, using sort of the same program structures. We also then built a series of multinational social impact programs with Unis Social Business. The core organization is based in Germany as well, but they have branches all over the world. So we ran programs in India and Uganda, South Africa, Portugal, randomly, like all over the place with them. And the different program, there were kind of two different program formats. One was what we deemed the Hyper Accelerator, which was a week-long, hyper-intense program. So basically 5 days for startups, 6 days for mentors, depending on how you looked at it. And then we had an elongated version of that, which used the exact same structure, but basically the days were broken over at least a week or 2 weeks at a time, which meant startups that wanted to dedicate more build time to complete a topic in between stages of the program had more than 24 hours to do it. So particularly for bigger existing teams, that was beneficial, or for slower moving industries. And between the two program types, we ran programs for everything from students with an idea to Series B startups. The program methodology was built to be to adapt to anyone that was in it, because the principle of interaction was what mattered the most. And so we were able to run the same program with 200 person, founders of 200 person companies in India that were, worth several billion, that we were with students in New Zealand that had an idea yesterday. And the outcomes and the ability to benchmark and expect the outcomes was the same in both cases, which was really the goal for us.
You mentioned that you and the team in Israel came up with the same conclusions. So were these conclusions revolving around that teams are prioritizing the wrong matrices, or they are not able to look at the problem in a particular way?
Yeah, I think so. The conclusions have a lot to do with qualifying and communication. So qualifying comes down to two components: qualifying mentors a certain way and qualifying entrepreneurs a certain way. On the entrepreneurial side, we identified that the most consistent trait of entrepreneurs that we deemed as successful, and we have our own definition for that VCs would not agree with, but that's fine, was adaptability. That was the core personality trait. And not to say that you have to be this adaptable or adaptability, but that adaptability is a scale, and there is a sweet spot in that scale. And if you, as a founding team or leadership team, or new entrepreneur or whatever, exist within that window on the adaptability scale, you have the highest likelihood of success.
I see.
The second piece of that was the mentor side, which was qualifying communication styles. So most programs, by contrast of example, most accelerator programs will just take people who have a big name, right? People who are known within the ecosystem. They're inherently a good mentor because people know who they are. But the problem is, if you take, with no other context, if you take famous mentor one and put them in front of a team, and team says, well, this and this and this is our problem, and the mentor goes, go this way, you're going to turn right here, because every experience that I've ever had says that if you don't turn right here, you'll fail. And the team goes, oh, great, okay, we'll turn right. Famous mentor one says we turn right, we'll turn right. And then 15 minutes later, famous mentor two sits down. Team says the same thing. Here are the problems, blah, blah, blah. And famous mentor two goes, well, I wouldn't go right because I've tried right, and that was an epic disaster. You got to go left here.
Yeah.
There is nothing in this for the team. You've not helped the team at all in this experience.
Yeah.
And in fact, you may have just made it more stressful and worse. And the important learning there is that that communication style and that mentoring methodology means that you haven't empowered the team to make their own decision, even though it's their company. What you've done is given them two contrasting opinions of people you've been told you have to listen to, and now you don't know where to go. So, if I'm honest about what the biggest difference between our program structures and all other program structures are, it's the fact that the teams are the least important part of the equation. Like, yes, we qualify them, right? We qualify them for adaptability. We qualify them for stage and good fit for the program and the right team size and all of these things that come with that. But they're much less important than the selection and qualification of mentors. So first of all, you don't want mentors with a chip on their shoulder. You don't want mentors who have only been consultants. You want mentors who are specialists in specific things that help founders of that specific stage.
Yeah.
And then additional to that, you want them to communicate a very particular way. And the communication scale can be looked at as effectively sort of a 3-point range, right? Where you have consulting on one side, teaching in the middle, and mentoring on the other extreme. And consulting is I tell you what to do and how to do it. Teaching is I tell you what you should do and you tell me when you've done it and I tell you whether or not you did it right. And mentoring is I ask you how you're going to do it.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And it's seems like a perfunctory difference, but it's actually extremely important, right? Like, and so our programs, you couldn't be a mentor at our program unless A, we recruited you, B, you passed 2 qualifying interviews, C, you showed up for a 4 to 6 hour long training with other mentors, and then and only then would any of our program experts let you sit with any teams at all, and you had to follow all of the handoff rules throughout the day to stay in the room the whole day. Because, to avoid mentor A says right, mentor 1 says right, mentor 2 says left, we also had all sorts of protocols within the program to avoid exactly that, right? Every mentor conversation should be a progression of previous conversations, not the same conversation over again. And so we made the mentors work arguably harder than the teams to make sure that the teams only moved forward and never stayed in place with multiple conversations. And that took a lot of coordination, and it took a lot of dealing with egos. It took kicking some famous people out of accelerators in the middle of an accelerator, which politically doesn't always play very well. But our job was to run the best program that we could, and that's what was required. So it was an interesting journey. And then running programs like this is inherently a very political process.
Really?
Yeah. Especially when you want to run them the way we run them and not the way VCs want them run. And so, there was a lot of sort of myth busting and data justification that had to happen to run programs the way we run programs. Also, because obviously the cost of running programs the way we did was higher because it was very staff intensive. And we didn't run programs as growth mechanics. We always ran them, powered by growth mechanics. We always wanted the localized entity to be the one that held the network together so that when we left, there was still a network. And that was part of the whole methodology. But that meant that we could never implement without that localized partner basically putting their name up and kind of at least partially funding the program. And it just became more and more political to run programs, and everyone on the team just kind of got tired of it. And so eventually we started shutting them down because we were building the portfolio slowly more and more and more, and that was way more fun and way more interesting and becoming sustainable in its own right. And so we just kind of slowly over the course of 2 years shifted gears from doing all programs to doing all our own companies.
The 3 points you laid out, consulting, teaching, and mentoring. Yeah, that made a lot of sense to me actually, because I have a lot of conversation with founders who are in some incubation program or some or the other so-called famous program you should be into if you're a first-time founder. And like few of them have been very frank about the kind of value they're getting, and one of them who was not happy at all kind of told me that all they gave me was a list of phone numbers. What am I supposed to do with it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
I can totally understand where you are getting with this.
Yeah, and network is a big sell for a lot of programs. And unfortunately, it's really only true for 3 or 4 of them. You know, Y Combinator, which was the first one, 500 startups, which worked very hard to catch up, and then Techstars kind of depending on what location in the world. And everything else, it's still unclear to me. I think one of the most astounding pieces of data about 2 or 3 years into doing programs, we did a snapshot study of teams coming out of programs compared to teams that applied to programs and hadn't been accepted,
Hmm.
which was a hard study to do. I can't say it was like we never published it as a data set because it's an ugly data set, right? None of the programs wanted that study to happen, right? So we had to do it totally scrappy. But we collected enough samples to sort of look at a couple hundred results and say, okay, what happened to the teams that weren't accepted versus the teams that were accepted? And in almost every program case,
Yeah.
the the teams that weren't accepted did better over the following year than the teams that were.
Wow.
And by better, I mean specifically like market adoption, validation of the product or service, like clear momentum of the business. If you look at funding numbers, which is what everyone looks at, completely opposite, right? Accelerator based teams had huge amounts of funding, non accelerator based teams or had much less. But the comparative success of the non accelerator teams was hilariously biased.
And do you think it is a lot of it's a political problem maybe?
It's just it's a VC conduit, right? The VC game is a statistics game. You invest in 100 and hope that one blows it out of the water. Or you invest in 300 and then you get 2 fire exits at scale and 1 IPO, right? Like that's the gamble that you're making. And unfortunately, accelerators are no different. In fact, they've just made that number game more so, right? So one of the most hilarious examples of sort of comparative program success is that Y Combinator runs multiple cohorts of 30 teams at a time, right? That's how they mature their funds, is that they get a lot of teams in, they have a huge network, and they pump them, and enough comes out of the 60 to 90 teams a year, enough becomes successful that between their selection bias and their network and everything else, that it matures their funds and they keep rolling. But then teams want to copy or new accelerator teams that have never run programs before, they want to copy the Y Combinator model, but they can only run a program with 8 teams or whatever a year. Like that's not going to cut it. That's statistically, it's impossible that would ever become sustainable, right? And as soon as they realize that, most of those accelerator programs go straight into corporate sponsorships. And then as soon as you have corporate sponsors, your only job is to recruit startups into a program that you can upsell into the corporate sponsors. And then the program is just only really about that. They can call it whatever they want, but that's the only purpose of the program in the end. And most programs in that sort of 3 years that we started phasing out, most programs that we were looking at or had issues with, or that people were looking at being like, well, they're doing it this way, all of them ended up doing that or closed. They either disappeared entirely or they all converted into sort of corporate verticalized sales programs.
I see. So they kind of lose integrity towards the end, and they don't do what they're supposed to.
Yeah, they're not really accelerator programs. They're just
Lead generation machines.
conduits for corporate partnership, which I would argue is not an accelerator program. You don't need a program to do that. You just need a set of partnership agreements and, maybe a little funding to keep the startup alive while you do the jazzy talk. But the accelerators look good because of what 500 and Y Combinator and and those types have done. So, but yeah, it's a silly world. The accelerator world is a silly world.
Hmm. So you kind of took all the things you learned from there and said no to all of that, and then decided that, you know what, maybe let's just do our own thing.
Yeah, I mean, we the amount of learning that I got from working with hundreds of mentors around the world and hundreds of startups. I think we counted at some point, we did a total assessment, and we've worked directly with 800 plus startups in our programs. That's a lot of data. Like, we've seen a lot of the same patterns, but we've seen a few things really stand out, whether it be people and how they behave, or identification of problems, or you know methodologies or perspective. It's there was an incredible amount of learning through that process for our whole team. And for me personally, it was a joy to be doing that, because it was very stressful running programs, especially if we had to be, whenever you're on the ground and you're the person operating the program day to day, it's very, very stressful. And we would have to cycle program experts and give them very long breaks, because a month of being a program expert is like you need like a half a year to recover from that. um and of course, that meant by default, every time we had a gap, I would go do it. So I've done a lot of programs myself. um and it's just the amount of learning you do in those environments. You're specifically recruiting mentors who are better than you, right? You're looking for mentors that can prove that you and no other team know everything, that they can communicate better, they can be topic experts better than you will ever be. And so you surround yourself with these absolutely brilliant people of every social, creed, national background you can imagine across all these different places. Um, and it's hard not to be inspired. It's hard not to want to walk away from that and be like, wow, I have all these ideas. Like, no one's doing this over here. Like, let's go do that. So it was very inspirational. And as frustrating as programs were, especially at the end, and what led to the decision to close them, they're incredibly inspirational for us. And we battle tested methodologies left and right. The first version of the program had a lot of similarities, but was very much improved by program number 50. And that methodology is what we use internally to start and build every initiative that we build. So yeah, we owe a lot to running the accelerators. And I think the greatest compliment for me when it comes to the programs is that we stopped running them years ago, but our whole thing was building these mentor ecosystems so that they could continue to help the ecosystem as a whole. And if you go look at accelerator programs in the ecosystems where we ran programs more than once, if you go to the accelerators in those areas, you see our program mechanisms being used. You see this sort of mentor spent time at our program, then went to this program over here and was like, well, this is crap, let's try this because I did it over here and it was great, and then they used it and it worked, and then they kept using it. You see that everywhere. Google still uses our program structures. They don't necessarily know how to use them anymore because all of those people have left, but but it's still the same decks, it's still the same processes. We built something that I think, whether or not we ever get credit for it, we built something that really did make an impact in that space, and hopefully for the betterment of startups all over the world. So it was a great privilege to do it.
Is there like a legal obligation that you cannot talk about it? Is anything like that to take credit
No,
or
I
something?
mean, I certainly can't talk about the specifics of who owns what
What the
and
program was,
why,
maybe.
and
Yeah, yeah,
what programs were run by whom, and blah blah blah. I can't talk about that
that's
type
fine.
of
Yeah,
stuff,
yeah,
but that's just it's not even by contract. It's mostly just politics. And Google is a very,
makes
very
sense.
big, powerful org, and we're not. So they can say whatever they want.
But yeah, yeah,
We know the work that we did, though, and And if you go look at those files, in the Google team for Launchpad, you can still see that I was the creator. So, that's all that was necessary. Um, Yeah, it's definitely influenced by our experience of running the accelerators. It's also influenced by our previous entrepreneurial histories. I've run multiple other companies before Growth Mechanics and its associated portfolio, and the other partners at Growth Mechanics are the same. Um, and It's just very clear for us, there are some conditions in industries where venture capital is a must have. There's no Whether it's venture capital or some other funding mechanism, you cannot do certain things or enter certain markets as a new entity without capital. But that certainly doesn't apply to everything. And if you're privileged enough to have either the time or just enough money to build something that can be self-generative in terms of revenue, um, it removes a lot of the weird narratives that come with funding and VC. And entrepreneurship has been around for thousands of years. VC is not that old by comparison, but entrepreneurship as a concept, whether it be for the cafe down the street or the big tech company in Silicon Valley, it's both entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship has been rebranded by the venture capitalist world as startups, as go big or go home, big risk, big reward. And I don't think that's certainly not how all business should behave. That's certainly not how all economics should behave, because it's hugely damaging to economics if you look at the bubbles it creates, and when they burst, what happens. But also, it doesn't disseminate finance very well. And so, while there are those contexts where capital is required, we prefer as much as possible to stay away from contexts where venture capital is a route forward for us. That doesn't mean we'll always avoid it. It's not like I'm black or white on the topic. I would always prefer to avoid external partners, external financial partners, avoid um, the bias that comes with investors and their expectations. And I encourage the teams that work with us still, whether or not they're part of the portfolio, to be extremely patient and slow about how they go about funding if they're going to do it. Um, but yeah, I think it really depends on context. I think the problem is that the default assumption is that you should go raise. And I would argue that the default assumption is that you should try to figure out how to do it without raising. And then raising is either your backup, or once you've already got something really moving and you want to really go huge in the next scale because you already know kind of what it is, how it's going to work, where it's going to go, then, great. Then you know what you're doing. Then get funding. But if you get funding too early, it's very hard not to read that funding as validation of what you're doing. Whereas if you don't exist in the market yet,
Yeah,
you have no idea.
I would say, these are all the kind of things I was thinking about before coming on the show. This was fun. This was very smooth. I would say very very calming. And how was it for you then?
Yeah, it was great. I did maybe too much talking. You would ask a question and I would kind of go on tangent. Again, sorry, my focus because of being ill has not been great. So I apologize if I took you on a bit more of a journey with every question than you originally intended. But this has been great fun. I've really enjoyed it.